The glass door of the executive suite slammed against its stopper hard enough to rattle the frosted panel beside it, and the folder that had been sitting on the edge of Charlotte Ashford's desk hit the floor in a spray of loose paper, pages sliding under the credenza, under her wheelchair, under the emergency medical kit nobody used anymore because everyone assumed she didn't need pity, she needed silence. The woman who had just quit, the fourth in 6 weeks, stood in the doorway with her coat already half-buttoned, her mouth open like she wanted to say something cutting and couldn't find it fast enough, and behind her, in the hallway, 3 other assistants from the adjacent floor had stopped walking entirely, watching the way people watch a car accident they're grateful not to be in. Charlotte's hands were flat on the arms of her chair, knuckles pale, and for one frozen second nobody in that office moved, not her, not the woman leaving, not the man standing quietly by the window, who hadn't been introduced to anyone yet because his interview wasn't even supposed to start for another 20 minutes. He was early, he'd been early his whole life. His name was Noah Bennett, and he would remember this exact moment. The papers scattered across imported oak flooring, the low hum of the city 30 floors below, the particular silence that follows a door slamming, as the moment everything in his life quietly, irreversibly, began to change. To find out how a widowed single father with no corporate experience became the only person Charlotte Ashford ever trusted again. Stay until the very end. 11 months earlier, none of this existed. Noah Bennett was carrying a stack of unopened bills to the kitchen table of a 2-bedroom rental in a suburb far enough from downtown that the commute alone ate 90 minutes of his day. And his son Mason, 10 years old and missing 2 front teeth he refused to let anyone mention, was doing homework at that same table with the particular seriousness only children bring to fractions. Noah had been a combat medic for 8 years before he left the service, and for 3 of the years since, he had been doing what he could. Night security, hospital transport, anything that let him pick Mason up from school more days than not. His wife had died 2 years earlier, quickly, quietly. The kind of illness that doesn't announce itself until it's already finished announcing itself. And in the aftermath, Noah had rebuilt his life around exactly one principle. Mason would never feel the ground disappear beneath him the way Noah once had. He didn't talk about grief. He didn't talk about the service, or the things he'd seen, or the 2 tours that had taught him how to sit perfectly still in a room full of chaos. He just showed up every day, on time, and did the next necessary thing. That was who he was when the staffing agency called about a temporary in-home and in-office assistant position for a corporate executive recovering from a serious accident. High pay, difficult client, 4 assistants already gone. Noah didn't ask why the pay was high. He needed the money, and he had never once in his life been afraid of difficult. Charlotte Ashford, 34 years old, was the CEO of Ashford Dynamics, a robotics and automation company her father had built from a garage, and that she had taken public at 29, doubling its valuation inside 18 months through a combination of technical brilliance and a willingness to work harder than anyone below her. She had been, by every account, formidable before the accident, sharp enough to correct her own engineers mid-sentence, demanding in a way that people forgave because she was usually right. 7 months before Noah walked into that office, the helicopter carrying her and 2 board members to a manufacturing site in the mountains had gone down in weather nobody had cleared it for. The 2 board members survived with minor injuries. Charlotte's spine had been damaged badly enough that she would likely never walk unassisted again, and the woman who returned to Ashford Dynamics 4 months later was not, in any way anyone recognized, the same person. She ran board meetings from a wheelchair with a fury that made grown executives avoid eye contact. She fired assistants for offering to carry things. She fired one for not offering. The company was 6 weeks from finalizing a defense and infrastructure contract worth $412 million, a deal that would secure Ashford Dynamics' next decade, and, though almost nobody in the building knew this yet, a deal the board was quietly preparing to take out of her hands if she couldn't demonstrate, in front of the client's due diligence team, that she was still fit to run the company she'd built. The man circling her like a patient, well-dressed problem was Victor Lang, her father's former COO and now her chief operating officer. A man in his late 40s with a voice built for boardrooms and a habit of finishing other people's sentences slightly wrong on purpose, just enough to make them sound less certain than they were. Victor had been quietly courting the board for 18 months, framing every one of Charlotte's post-accident outbursts as evidence, gathering allies the way some men collect watches, carefully, patiently, for the appearance as much as the ownership. He smiled at Charlotte in meetings and undermined her within the hour. Nobody thought of him as a villain. That was the whole design. Noah's interview lasted 4 minutes. He walked in exactly on time, early in fact, which was how he witnessed the fourth assistant's exit. And when the recruiter from the staffing agency, flustered and apologetic, asked if he still wanted to proceed given what he'd just seen, Noah said only that he'd worked in worse rooms than this one. Charlotte, papers still scattered at her feet, looked at him for the first time with something sharper than curiosity. She asked him one question. Did he expect her to thank him for the job? Noah said no. He said he expected to do the job well, and that gratitude wasn't part of the transaction either way. Something in her face changed then, almost imperceptibly, the way a held breath changes a person's shoulders without anyone noticing they'd been holding it. She told him to start Monday. She did not pick the papers up herself, and neither did he. He simply knelt, gathered them in order, and set them on the desk without comment, the way he might once have reassembled a field kit after chaos, methodically, without needing to be told twice. It was, though neither of them would have called it this yet, the first ordinary thing that had happened to Charlotte Ashford in 7 months. The first weeks established the shape of things. Noah arrived at 6:15 each morning to help with the transfer from her apartment's medical bed to the modified vehicle, a task the previous assistants had approached with visible discomfort that Charlotte read, correctly, as pity, and that Noah approached the way he approached moving any patient, with brisk, competent hands and no wasted words. He didn't ask if she was in pain. He watched for the small signs, the tightening at her jaw, the particular stillness of her left hand, and adjusted before she had to ask. At the office, he learned the building faster than anyone expected, learned which elevator ran smoothest, which conference rooms had door frames too narrow for her chair and needed rerouting around, learned to have her second coffee ready 12 minutes before the first board call, because that was when her focus dipped. He was not deferential. When she snapped at him the first week, a sharp, testing remark about whether he even understood what he'd signed up for, he simply said that he understood exactly what he'd signed up for, and continued setting up her morning schedule as though the comment had cost him nothing at all, because it hadn't. Charlotte, who had spent 7 months either being coddled or fled from, did not know what to do with a man who was neither afraid of her nor sorry for her. It unsettled her more than his competence did, and she would not have admitted, even to herself, how much she had started listening for the particular sound of his footsteps in the hallway each morning, steady, unhurried, the one constant in a year that had otherwise come apart at every seam. Then, on a Wednesday nobody flagged as important. Mason's school called Noah during a board strategy session to say a half-day dismissal notice had gone out that morning, and no one had picked him up. Noah had no one else to call. He asked Charlotte, in front of Victor Lang and 2 board members, if he could bring his son to the office for 2 hours after school. It was a small, ordinary request from a man who had never asked her for anything. What happened next would set in motion everything that followed. Though in that moment it looked like nothing more than a 10-year-old boy walking hesitantly into the most powerful woman's office, holding a half-finished worksheet on fractions, unsure whether he was allowed to be there at all. 6 months later, that same worksheet would still be sitting, folded, in the top drawer of Charlotte Ashford's desk, though it would take an entire unraveling, a public humiliation, and a truth nobody saw coming before either of them understood why Mason Bennett had his father's stillness and his late mother's curiosity, an unusual combination that meant he watched rooms carefully before he ever spoke in them. And when he was led into Charlotte's office that Wednesday afternoon by an assistant who clearly considered it an imposition, he did not do what every other visitor in that building had learned to do, which was avoid looking directly at the wheelchair. He looked at it the way a 10-year-old looks at anything unfamiliar and interesting, openly, without agenda, and then he asked her, with no preamble at all, whether it could go fast. Charlotte, who had fired a man 3 days earlier for offering to hold a door, found herself laughing, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch in her own throat like it belonged to someone else. She told him it could go faster than his father would like. Mason grinned his gap-toothed grin and asked if she'd ever raced anyone in it. She said no. He said that seemed like a waste of a very good machine. Noah, watching from the doorway with his heart somewhere in his throat because he had no idea how his employer would react to a child, treating her disability like a fun fact instead of a tragedy, saw something in Charlotte's face he hadn't seen in the 3 weeks he'd worked for her. She looked, for just a moment, like a person rather than a problem to be managed. It became, without anyone officially agreeing to it, a routine. Mason came by after school, 2 or 3 afternoons a week, did his homework at the small table in the corner of Charlotte's office while she worked, and somewhere in the space between her phone calls and his fraction worksheets, they began talking about robots, mostly, because Mason had decided Ashford Dynamics was the coolest place he'd ever seen, and about school, and once, memorably, about whether Charlotte's chair could be modified with what Mason called rockets, a suggestion she took seriously enough to sketch 2 possible thruster configurations on a napkin before catching herself and asking if this was what qualified as unprofessional. Mason told her it qualified as awesome. Noah said nothing, but he noticed that Charlotte's assistant call logs, tracked meticulously by the executive floor's scheduling software, showed she'd started staying 20, 30 minutes later some evenings, not because of deadlines, but because Mason's presence had made the office feel like somewhere worth lingering. The trouble arrived 6 weeks in, on the day the due diligence team from the $412 million contracts client, a joint infrastructure authority represented by a delegation of 11 external evaluators, came to observe Ashford Dynamics' leadership in a live operational review. It was, everyone understood, the closest thing to a final exam a CEO could be given. Could Charlotte Ashford run a room, hold technical detail under pressure, project the steadiness a $400 million partner needed to see? Victor Lang had spent 2 weeks quietly suggesting to board members, in the particular tone he used for concerns he wanted repeated by someone other than himself, that perhaps he should lead the technical portion given the demands on Charlotte's recovery. A phrasing calibrated to sound like concern and land like a demotion. Charlotte had refused. She would run it herself. 40 minutes into the review, in front of the full delegation and 6 board members, Charlotte's left hand seized. A lingering effect of the spinal trauma that surfaced under stress and exhaustion, something her doctors had warned could happen, and that she had told no one about, not even Noah, because admitting it existed felt like admitting the accident had taken more than her legs. Her control screen slipped from her lap. The room went silent in the specific way. Rooms go silent when everyone present is deciding, in real time, whether to help or to pretend they haven't noticed. And it was Victor who moved first. Not to help her, but to step forward and address the delegation directly, smoothly picking up the technical thread as though he'd simply been waiting for a natural pause, his voice warm with practiced reassurance, his eyes flicking once toward the board chair in a look that said everything his words didn't. Charlotte sat frozen, hand curled uselessly against the arm of her chair, watching her own company's future being narrated by someone else, while 11 strangers decided, silently, whether she was still capable of holding it. Noah was not in the room. Assistants weren't permitted in evaluator sessions, but he was close enough, in the anteroom outside, to hear the shift in tone through the door, the particular cadence of Victor taking control of a room that wasn't his. He did not go in. That wasn't his place, and he understood, with the same clarity that had once told him which wounds needed pressure and which needed a tourniquet, that his usefulness here was in what happened after, not during. When Charlotte was wheeled out 90 minutes later, the review formally concluded. Her face was arranged into the flat, controlled expression of someone holding something together by main force, and she did not speak to him on the ride home. She did not speak to him the next morning either. 2 days after that, she told him, without meeting his eyes, that the board had asked Victor to lead point on the remaining stages of the contract negotiation, that her role would be advisory through signing, and that, her voice thinning on this last part in a way Noah had never heard from her, she thought it would be better if Mason stopped coming to the office for a while. She didn't explain why. Noah didn't ask her to. He simply said he understood, packed Mason's fraction worksheet into his own bag that evening, so it wouldn't be thrown out with the rest of the papers on her desk, and drove home in silence, aware that something had broken that had taken 6 quiet weeks to build, and with no idea yet how badly it had actually broken her, or how far Victor Lang intended to take it. 3 weeks would pass before Noah understood that the woman who'd stopped speaking to her own assistant had also stopped speaking, almost entirely, to herself. The 3 weeks that followed were the quietest Noah had ever seen Charlotte, and he had by then seen her furious, seen her exhausted, seen her laugh at a 10-year-old's rocket thruster sketches. This quiet was different, a controlled, methodical withdrawal, the kind Noah recognized from soldiers who'd stopped believing the mission was still theirs to run. She still worked. She still showed up before 7 most mornings, still reviewed every technical document that crossed her desk with the same exacting eye. But she had stopped arguing in meetings where Victor now did most of the talking, had stopped correcting him even when Noah, who had learned enough about the company's engineering by then to follow along, could tell he was simplifying things in ways that weren't quite accurate, small distortions calibrated to make himself sound essential and her sound peripheral. Noah kept his schedule exactly the same. He still had her coffee ready 12 minutes before the first call. He still adjusted the office thermostat the half-degree she preferred without being asked. He said nothing about Victor, and he said nothing about Mason, and this consistency, this refusal to either abandon her or push, was, though Charlotte would not have named it this way yet, the only steady thing left in her days. The crack began in a place nobody was watching. Priya Malik, a senior contracts analyst who had worked under Charlotte's father before Charlotte took over, had been present in the anteroom the day of the failed review, filing paperwork close enough to hear fragments of what Victor said to 2 board members afterward, in the hallway, once he believed no one relevant was listening. A comment about how this might finally settle the succession question, said with the particular lightness of a man pretending a plan wasn't a plan. Priya had said nothing at the time, out of the same self-preserving caution that had kept dozens of people quiet through dozens of company transitions before this one. But she had also, out of an old loyalty to Charlotte's father that had never fully transferred to Victor, begun quietly pulling contract review timestamps, comparing the technical language Victor was now presenting to the delegation against the original specifications Charlotte had drafted 8 months before the accident, back when the deal had first been structured. What she found, alone in her office late on a Thursday, was that 2 of the load-bearing safety specifications in the infrastructure contract's current draft, the version Victor was about to finalize, had been quietly loosened from Charlotte's originals. Changes that shaved cost but meaningfully increased long-term failure risk in exactly the kind of high-load public infrastructure application the client intended to deploy it in. It was the sort of change that would look, on paper, like a minor engineering adjustment, and would only ever become visible as a catastrophe years down the line, long after everyone currently in the room had moved on to other titles. Priya did not go to Charlotte directly. She barely knew her, and the org chart between them ran through Victor. She went, instead, to the one person in the building everyone had noticed paid close, careful attention to everything, Noah, who by now had a reputation on the executive floor as the assistant who remembered which conference room had bad acoustics, and which board member took her tea without sugar despite what her assistant always ordered. Priya didn't fully trust Noah either, not at first, but she trusted, correctly, that he would not immediately weaponize what she told him, and she trusted that whatever he did with it, he would do carefully. She showed him the specification comparison in the parking garage after hours, her hands shaking slightly as she scrolled through it on her tablet, and asked him, flatly, what he thought she should do. Noah looked at it for a long time. He had no engineering background, but he understood risk assessment the way 8 years of triage teaches a person to understand it. And he understood immediately that this was not a story about corporate politics anymore. This was a story about whether a bridge or a grid system, or whatever this contract eventually built, might fail under load in a decade and hurt people who had no idea any of this had happened. He told Priya to send him everything, quietly and told her he would find the right way to get it to Charlotte, without exposing her to Victor's retaliation before Charlotte had a chance to act on it. That night, Noah did something he had never done in 5 months of working for Charlotte Ashford. He asked to speak with her outside of work hours, at her apartment, about something that wasn't on the schedule. She let him in warily, expecting a resignation. She had, if she was honest with herself, been waiting for one for 3 weeks, certain that eventually even Noah's patience would run out the way everyone else's had. Instead, he set his phone on her kitchen counter, opened the file Priya had sent, and said nothing at all, letting her read it herself, watching the specific way her face changed as she understood what she was looking at. Not confusion, but the fast, cold clarity of an engineer recognizing exactly how dangerous a small change could be. She looked up at him and asked, very quietly, whether he understood what this meant. Noah said he understood. It meant someone had made her company's flagship contract less safe to make himself look more essential, and that whoever had done it was about to sign her name to the final version in 6 days. He did not tell her what to do next. He had learned, over 5 months, that Charlotte Ashford did not want to be handled, managed, or protected. She wanted, more than anything, to be trusted with the truth and left to decide. So he simply stood there, in her kitchen, at 10 at night, and waited. What Charlotte said next surprised him. She did not immediately talk about Victor, or the contract, or the board. She asked him, instead, why Mason had stopped coming by, when Noah himself had never given any indication he'd stopped wanting him to. Noah told her the truth, that she had asked him not to bring Mason anymore 3 weeks earlier, and that he'd respected it without asking why, because it wasn't his place to push. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost the flat control it had carried for 3 weeks. She admitted, haltingly, that the day of the failed review had been the first time since the accident that she'd let herself believe, fully, that she might not be the person she used to be. Not physically, she'd made a kind of peace with that months ago, but in the way that mattered to running a company, the sharpness, the reliability under pressure, and that she had pushed Mason away not because of anything he'd done, but because some small, ashamed part of her hadn't wanted a child to watch her lose the last thing she had left. Noah did not offer comfort. He simply told her, plainly, that in 5 months he had never once seen her fail to notice the exact thing that mattered in a room, including tonight, and that a seized hand during a stress episode was not evidence of anything except that her body had been through a helicopter crash 7 months ago, a fact she seemed to keep forgetting in her rush to judge herself. Something in Charlotte's face broke open then, not into tears exactly, but into something closer to relief, the particular relief of a person being told, finally, by someone who had no reason to lie, that the story she'd been telling herself wasn't true. The urgency of the contract cut the moment short, before either of them could sit with it. Charlotte, sharper now than she'd been in weeks, told Noah she needed everything Priya had, verified and time-stamped, and she needed it quietly, because if Victor knew she was building a case before she was ready, he would simply push the signing date forward and bury the evidence in a final executed contract that would be far harder to unwind. She had 6 days. Noah told her he'd get her whatever she needed. What neither of them said aloud, though both were aware of it sitting in the room between them, was that this fight was no longer only about a contract. It was about who Charlotte Ashford still believed she was, and whether the quiet, steady man who'd never once treated her like something broken might be the only person in the building who could help her prove it. 6 days would pass, and on the 6th, in a boardroom neither Noah nor Priya had been invited into, Victor Lang would make one final mistake that would undo 18 months of careful positioning in less than 4 minutes. The 6 days moved fast and quiet. Charlotte worked nights, cross-referencing every specification Victor had touched since the accident against her own original engineering files, building not an accusation but a technical record, so precise it would leave no room for the kind of reasonable-sounding deflection Victor had built his entire career on. Noah handled everything around the edges that let her focus, rescheduling meetings without explanation, running interference when Victor's assistant asked pointed questions about Charlotte's sudden late nights, and quietly coordinating with Priya to secure a second, independent verification of the specification changes from an outside structural engineer Priya's late mentor had once worked with, someone with no ties to Ashford Dynamics who could confirm, on paper, that the load tolerances Victor's version specified fell measurably short of the client's own stated infrastructure safety requirements. It was Noah, in fact, who suggested the single detail that would matter most. Rather than confronting Victor privately, where he could soften, reframe, or simply deny, Charlotte should present the discrepancy in the next full board and delegation session, the one where Victor was scheduled to formally walk the client through the final contract terms before signing, the exact stage he'd spent 18 months maneuvering to control. Noah didn't frame it as revenge, and Charlotte, to her credit, didn't want it framed that way either. He framed it, simply, as the only way to make sure the truth landed where it could actually stop something dangerous from being built. Mason, unaware of any of this, was the one who unknowingly cracked something open 2 days before the meeting. Charlotte, working late at the office on a Tuesday, had asked Noah, almost sheepishly, a register he'd never heard from her, whether he'd bring Mason by, just once, before everything came to a head. Because she wanted, she said, to remember what the office felt like before it became a battlefield. Mason arrived with a new fraction worksheet and a hand-drawn diagram of a wheelchair, with what he was now calling stabilizer thrusters. And while Charlotte reviewed it with the same seriousness she gave $400 million contracts, she mentioned, almost offhand, that she used to build things like this for fun before she became too busy running the company to build anything at all. Mason asked her why she stopped. She didn't have a good answer. Noah, watching from across the room, understood that his son had just asked her, without meaning to, the exact question she needed to answer for herself before walking into that boardroom. The meeting was scheduled for 10 on Thursday morning. The full board, 6 senior evaluators from the delegation returning for final contract walkthrough, and Victor Lang at the head of the technical presentation, visibly more confident than Charlotte had seen him in months, a man who believed the last obstacle between himself and formal operational control had already quietly resolved itself. Charlotte arrived 11 minutes early. Noah had made sure of it. The same instinct that had once gotten him into her office, before an interview even started. And she did not sit at the periphery where Victor had, without ever formally announcing it, begun placing her chair in recent weeks. She positioned herself at the head of the table herself, and when Victor began his walkthrough, confidently narrating the final specifications as though they were simply the natural evolution of Charlotte's original design, she let him get 4 minutes into it before she spoke. She did not raise her voice. She asked him, in the same precise technical register she used to run engineering reviews before the accident, to explain the load-bearing tolerance discrepancy between Section 14 of his current draft and her original specification file, dated 8 months prior. Victor, for a fraction of a second, hesitated. A small thing, almost nothing, but Noah, watching from the doorway where assistants were permitted to stand for procedural sessions, saw it land on every face at that table, the first crack in 18 months of practiced composure. Victor recovered quickly, offering the same language he'd used with the board privately, framing the change as a routine cost efficiency with negligible safety impact. But Charlotte was ready for exactly this. She had Priya's documentation, the independent structural engineer's signed verification, and, the detail that mattered most, a direct comparison showing that Victor's revised tolerances fell below not just Charlotte's original specification, but below the client's own minimum published infrastructure safety standard, a standard the delegation's own lead evaluator, sitting at that table, had personally co-authored 3 years earlier. The room's temperature changed in real time. The lead evaluator, a woman named Renata Ose, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire process, asked to see the comparison directly, and as she reviewed it, her expression shifted from polite attention to something considerably colder. She asked Victor, directly, whether he had been aware the revised specifications fell below the published standard when he presented them as final. Victor's answer, a long, technical explanation about cost modeling and acceptable risk thresholds that never actually answered the question, told everyone in that room everything they needed to know. Charlotte let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to, and then, without triumph in her voice, without anything that could be mistaken for gloating, she said simply, that Ashford Dynamics would not be presenting a contract with specifications below the client's own safety threshold, that the original figures would be restored before any signing proceeded, and that the board would need to determine, separately, how a change of this magnitude had been made without her knowledge, or the delegations. It took 11 more days for the full picture to unravel. A board-commissioned internal review that found Victor had made the changes quietly over 4 months, timed specifically to the period when Charlotte's post-accident recovery made her review of technical documents less frequent, banking on a signature deadline that would lock the terms before anyone noticed. He resigned before the review's findings were formally presented to the full board, framing it, even then, in the same smooth corporate language he'd used for 18 months, calling it a decision to pursue new opportunities. Nobody in that room believed it, and nobody corrected it either, because by then it no longer mattered what Victor called it. What mattered was that Charlotte Ashford had walked back into her own boardroom. In the wheelchair Victor had spent months quietly using as evidence against her, and had been the sharpest, steadiest person in it. Renata Ose, before leaving that day, told Charlotte directly that the delegation had never doubted the technology, only, for a period, the leadership behind it, and that today had resolved that doubt more completely than any presentation could have. Charlotte thanked her, and then, for the first time in the 11 months Noah had known her, allowed herself to sit in a hallway afterward and simply breathe, shoulders down, hands still. The fight finally, fully over. She did not call Noah into that hallway. She didn't need to. He was already there, the way he always was, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. 2 months would pass before either of them found the words for what came next. Not the company, not the contract, but the quieter, harder question of what they had actually built between them in 11 months of showing up for each other, and what, if anything, either of them was brave enough to call it. The public restoration happened 3 weeks after Victor's resignation. At the same all-hands meeting, where Ashford Dynamics formally announced the signed infrastructure contract. $412 million. Specifications fully restored to Charlotte's original standard. The client's delegation present in person as a gesture of confidence rarely extended twice. The board chair, a careful man who had spent 18 months quietly hedging his bets on Victor, stood in front of the full company and credited Charlotte publicly, unambiguously, as the person whose technical judgment had protected the deal, and, by extension, the company's future. It was the kind of moment Charlotte might once have wanted desperately. Vindication delivered in front of everyone who doubted her. Standing at the podium in the wheelchair, she no longer flinched from being seen in. She thanked the board, thanked Renata Ose's delegation for their diligence, and then did something nobody in that room expected. She named Priya Malik and Noah Bennett specifically, describing in careful, factual terms exactly what each of them had done and why it mattered, refusing to let the credit collapse into a single vague reference to the team. Priya was promoted within the month to lead the contracts division. Noah, standing near the back of the room in the same quiet posture he brought to everything, simply nodded once when people turned to look at him, and said nothing, because that had never been what he was in this for. Afterward, the board chair offered Charlotte a public gesture, a formal company-wide announcement naming Noah as her permanent executive chief of staff, a title with a corner office and a salary that would have changed his and Mason's life overnight. Noah declined it, gently, in a private conversation with Charlotte the following week, and when she asked why, visibly confused that anyone would turn down that kind of security, he told her the truth. That titles and offices weren't what he'd been working toward, and that what he actually wanted, if she was serious about offering something, was smaller and stranger than that. A formal mentorship and paid apprenticeship track within Ashford Dynamics for veterans transitioning out of service. People like him, disciplined and overlooked, who had skills nobody in corporate hiring knew how to translate onto a resume. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment and then said, quietly, that it was the first request anyone had made of her all year that had nothing to do with what they could get from her, and that she'd have it drafted by the end of the month. It launched 4 months later under a name Mason, consulted seriously on the matter, insisted on. The Steady Hands program. It still runs today. The quiet coda came on an ordinary Saturday, nearly a year after the crash review, that had once nearly cost Charlotte everything. In the small yard behind the accessible house she'd moved into that spring, close enough to Noah and Mason's neighborhood that the commute for morning transfers had shrunk to 11 minutes. Mason was in the yard demonstrating, with great seriousness, a wheelchair attachment he and two engineers from Ashford Dynamics' youth outreach program had actually built as a design exercise. Not real thrusters, but a set of stabilizer wheels for uneven ground, something Charlotte genuinely used now on the yard's soft grass. She laughed at something Mason said, easily, without the careful control that used to sit behind everything she did. And Noah, watching from the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, one black, one with exactly the amount of sugar she actually preferred, rather than what her old assistants had always guessed, felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't let himself name in over 2 years. Charlotte wheeled over, took the mug, and asked him, not for the first time, what he'd been so afraid of that whole first year, the not asking, the not reaching. Noah told her the truth, the way he told her everything now. That after his wife died, he'd built his entire life around never letting Mason's ground disappear again, and that for a long time he hadn't believed he was allowed to want anything more than steady. Charlotte set her mug down on the porch railing and told him, simply, that steady was the whole reason any of this had survived, hers included, and that she wasn't interested in anything else. On the small table between their 2 chairs sat a single folded worksheet on fractions, the same one from 11 months earlier, still kept, still unthrown, a small paper reminder of the exact ordinary afternoon everything had actually begun. If you've ever been the person nobody noticed in the room, the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one everybody assumed had less to offer because you didn't perform your worth loudly enough for anyone to see it, this story was for you. Charlotte Ashford didn't need someone to fix her, and Noah Bennett was never trying to. He simply refused to look away, refused to flinch, refused to treat her like something broken, and in doing that, he gave her back the one thing every powerful person eventually loses without realizing it, the belief that she was still worth showing up for, exactly as she was. Worth isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself in boardrooms or headlines. Most of the time, it looks like showing up on time, saying the true thing quietly, and staying when everyone else has already walked out the door. If this story meant something to you, stay close. Because the final truth of what Noah almost didn't tell Charlotte, the one thing he kept from her even longer than the truth about Victor, is still waiting at the very end.